Welcome. Thank you so much for joining. My name's Emerald Sage. I'm the co-founder and CEO of the Digital Resilience Project. Whether you're here because you're curious, passionate about cybersecurity, interested in volunteering, or just simply want to learn a little bit more about who we are and the work that we're doing, thank you so much for choosing to spend your time with us this evening. We understand and appreciate that time is one of the most valuable things that any of us has. And the fact that you've chosen to spend the time with us learning about how you might help others says a great deal about the kind of people you are. So regardless of whether you decide to volunteer with us, thank you for caring enough to be part of this conversation. By the end of the session tonight, we hope that you'll have a clear understanding of who we are, how we work, and whether you want to use your skills within our growing volunteer community. We'll spend around maybe 30-40 minutes walking you through who we are and why we exist and the work that we do through a presentation. But we want to leave plenty of time at the end for questions and a discussion. Feel free to jump in and ask questions as we go. We will unmute the microphones at the end as well. So if you'd like to verbally ask questions as opposed to popping them in the chat, there'll be an opportunity to do that too. Before we get started, I also just want to acknowledge that tonight we're going to be talking about some pretty heavy topics. They include domestic and family violence, things like sextortion, people undergoing trauma. So it's really important that we take care of each other this evening during this discussion. So if you need to step away at any point, please do. There's always help available. If you'd like to reach out to any one of us, you can do so directly through the chat. I'm delighted to be joined by other members of the Digital Resilience Project team tonight. Brett is going to help me go through the finer points of the presentation. Brett essentially heads up our volunteers and our cyber services and remediation division. Then Chris is going to talk about our education programs and volunteering under our education program. We've also got James, who's another one of our cyber expert and cyber remediation and support services and advice volunteers. Both of our volunteers are going to talk about their experiences, the drivers behind their decisions to volunteer with us and how they've found the journey so far. I really encourage you to ask as many questions as possible while you've got them. Let's get started. So let's set the scene. Let's define the challenge that we're set up to face. Well, technology facilitated abuse in Australia is often part of a broader pattern of abusive behaviour. We find that victim survivors who suffer from technology facilitated abuse will do so in the context of other trauma such as domestic and family violence, sextortion, or other criminal related activity. So traditionally in Australia, what people have done when they've been in a situation of domestic and family violence or sextortion to a lesser extent, they've usually turned to really well-established community-based organisations, processes and systems that have been in place for a very long time. These services and organisations, they include things like shelters, and these are incredibly important places for help seeking. They provide victim survivors with safety advice, safety planning, secure housing, things like that. Victim survivors will also turn to various crisis lines for support, counsellors, community organisations that provide other supports and legal aid. And for decades, that's been enough. However, technology has evolved to a point where in today's context, it's introduced specialist cyber and intelligence problems into the landscape of violence and abuse. So that's why technology facilitated abuse is such an issue at the moment in Australia. We sort of want to look at what causes the problem in the first place. So what are the underlying drivers? So if we look within the context of domestic and family violence, we see drivers such as power disparity between gender, particularly in certain cultures and communities. We can see a sense of masculine entitlement and rigid gender norms driving some of those behaviours. We can also see other social norms that excuse or minimise harm, such as victim blaming. We often see structural inequalities like economic pressures, visa dependence, or racial discrimination. And these are particularly in communities that are culturally and linguistically diverse. And then we also have to acknowledge the trauma histories for both victim survivors and people who use violence. So if we look at technology within this context, some of the driving factors are the gaps between innovation and safeguards. So essentially what we mean there is that technology evolves faster than user awareness, than government policy directives and protections, and this creates the opportunity for misuse. Also, we're seeing that innovation is driving this trend whereby technologies are becoming easier for the end user. So this means that everyday technologies that previously haven't been used for coercive control are now being used for things like surveillance, impersonation, image-based abuse, etc. And the threshold to use technology in that way is low in terms of technical expertise. So we've talked about what technology facilitated abuse is, the context in which it takes place. We've talked about the drivers behind it. It's important that we acknowledge that technology facilitated abuse is quite complex and it consists of multiple different domains. And we find it really useful to break technology facilitated abuse up into two separate domains, because this allows us to do is structure our response to it. So one of the domains that we've used is digital abuse. We classify this as being an online environment. So abuse that takes the form of social media harassment, doxing, online impersonation, image-based abuse, and abusive messaging and threats. In the second category, we have technology facilitated abuse, which we can think of as devices and systems. Abusive behaviour under this category can include things like installing spyware or stalkerware on someone's devices, using GPS and AirTags, smart home device misuse, compromising online accounts, and abusing cloud-based access. So in talking about technology facilitated abuse and defining what it is, in categorizing components of it, we also need to acknowledge that it's not because technology is bad, it's because people are using it for malicious purposes. So when we're looking for technology facilitated abuse, yes, we're looking for digital traces on physical systems, but we're also looking for behaviours, because those behaviours drive how those devices and systems are abused. So we find it really useful to break typical perpetrator behavioural cycle up into three phases. So we have grooming and normalisation, which is usually the beginning behaviours in a relationship. So grooming in this context refers to the gradual establishment of access, trust, dependency, and surveillance disguised as intimacy. So a perpetrator engaged in this stage of a relationship will verbalise that behaviour through statements like, we should share accounts because we shouldn't have any secrets between us, and things like location sharing builds trust. You want me to trust you, don't you? So why don't you share your location? After grooming and normalization of control is established, that's when access consolidation and asserting control really starts to occur. So this usually involves embedding stable access into accounts, devices, or data. This behaviour is often manifest in statements along the lines of, we share everything in this relationship, so of course you're going to share this stuff with me. And it's just easier if we share accounts. So the sharing is sort of phrased as being convenient. So after asserting control, then comes escalation and retaliation. And this usually occurs if victim survivor starts to push back and try to assert some boundaries, or the victim survivor starts seeking outside help to enforce those boundaries. So in this context, or in this phase of behaviour, a perpetrator has a perceived loss of control, which triggers the intensification. And they'll use words like, you forced me to do this. I didn't want to, but I had to. I had no choice. So this is sort of what technology facilitated abuse looks like. How has Australia as a nation responded to date? Well, there are a number of pieces of legislation, particularly in criminal law, that encompass things like online stalking, online threats, and online expressions of coercive control. Interestingly, Queensland, I think, has some really excellent coercive control legislation that came in after the tragic circumstances around the death of Hannah Clark and her children. So, family is a major one. What often happens, particularly where technology facilitated abuse occurs within the context of domestic and family violence, is that a victim survivor will often go and seek a restraining order to end physical violence. And if we think back to our phases of perpetrator behaviour, there's often an intensification of the perpetrator's behaviour, and that intensification goes from physical abuse to online abuse. So quite often it's at that point that we really start to see an acceleration of technology facilitated abuse. Australia's responded by royal commissions, and there have been a number of them to date. The Victorian Royal Commission, for example, after the tragic death of Luke Batty, triggered a whole of system overhaul, including new laws, frameworks, and service models. There's regulation and the E-Safety Commissioner. So we are establishing a relationship with the E-Safety Commissioner to essentially work with them when it comes to platform takedown notices. So, for example, in a case of technology facilitated abuse, which might include image-based abuse, let's say a perpetrator is setting up accounts that pertain to be the victim survivor and then posting explicit images on those, we can refer that to the safety commissioner. The safety commissioner then has the power and authority to go to the platform where that content is hosted and issue a takedown order. The federal government has some policies around technology facilitated abuse. One that's relevant is Australia's National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children, which provides a coordinated 10-year strategy. Australia is also a signatory to or upholds the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, recognising that family violence is a human rights and workplace safety issue. Okay, so Australia is doing something about it, which is great, but we alluded to the fact that we've still got a ways to go, and there's definitely gaps in how we respond to technology facilitated abuse. So what are those gaps? Well, a big gap is the fact that a lot of the services that are set up and existing today don't provide ongoing support. Quite often when a perpetrator has targeted a victim survivor online and some remediation measures have been undertaken, the perpetrator will then seek to re-establish access through covert means. So that might be creating new social media platform accounts, impersonating someone else that they can then use to gain access to the victim survivor. So we need to get much better at providing sort of aftercare, if you will. Capability for complex digital environments. So we know that people are really complex tech ecosystems today. And quite often what we see in Australia's response is there are services and pay for a service companies that will offer a component of what someone needs in a technology solution, but that will be all. So to give you an example, let's say a victim survivor has noticed an issue with a mobile device. They've then taken that mobile device home and connected it to a new network and then noticed some issues with that network. So under the current way in which a lot of these systems operate, they'd be able to go to a company and get remediation services for the device. However, if the network has been compromised, when they go home and connect the new device or the clean device to that network, it may possibly become compromised again. So that's one of the things that we want to address and change. Accessibility of support. So this is a really big one. For example, here in Australia, what often happens is that victim survivors, particularly in domestic and family violence contexts, will be able to access funding in order to get technology remediation support and advice. However, that funding is means tested. So a lot of victim survivors meet eligibility criteria to access that money and therefore those services. Another key issue to highlight here is that while there might be a lot of businesses that operate in metropolitan areas around Australia's major cities, when we look at regional towns and centres, there'll be very little support services that are on hand and available. So again, this is sort of something that we want to work on and address. The other thing too that we need to note is speed of response. So quite often technology facilitated abuse comes with real-time imperatives. So for example, a perpetrator may have compromised a victim survivor's ability to access their finances, to access their home, to access systems and technologies that they rely on for things like health and a child's education. So quite often when we receive a request for help, that needs to be actioned straight away. So support services need to be really agile and quick moving, which again is something that we want to address. Brett, are you happy for me to hand over to you for our response?
Yeah. I'll take some of the
Amazing.
load, give you the break.
Thank you. Lovely.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining. I just thought I'd start talking about how this is going to look like from a framework perspective. Before I do that, I want to introduce why I joined and how I came about getting involved with Emerald. It's, I work professionally in cybersecurity. While that's pretty satisfying, protecting enterprises and doing all the stuff we do every day in cyber, I felt like I wanted to give back to people who use my skills. Right? There's people aren't always au fait with technology. They don't have access to the right people. It's cost money, as Emerald alluded to get those services. And I think there's a lot of us in the industry, not just in cyber, but IT and other skills that can give back and do it in such a way that we can improve people's lives. So essentially, what we're trying to do here is mobilize a workforce, right? A technical workforce. And while we're using the term cyber, it's really about technical skills plus some other skills I'll talk about a bit later. And how do we deploy those resources in a way that meets both our safety guidelines and our frameworks, which we're going to discuss a bit later, but also to protect our clients and our volunteers as well, right? So we're trying to essentially bring two programs to bear. There's what we call in cyber remediation, if you like. It's the response capability, the ability to offer help to somebody in real time or near real time, sort of like a first responder type mode. But then there's the proactive side of that, which is the capability uplift. And Chris will talk a little bit about that and the sort of training we're trying to build, the education programs. And both of these sort of capabilities, we need volunteers in, right? We're not just looking for tech experts here. We're talking to people who can cover both those capabilities that we're building. What does that really look like, right? So technical ability is super important. We're hoping we can bring people in who are experts in typical cybersecurity skill sets and IT skill sets. Maybe it's those intelligence skill sets. But more broadly, there's the need for support people, right? People who can help us program manage and do communications and marketing and training, education, research, admin. There's always room for people who can help. And basically, our real minimum viable requirement, if you want to use that term, is we do care, right? And we'll talk about timeframes. It doesn't have to be full time. It's obviously not going to be full time. We all have jobs, but it could be 1 hour a month. It could be a couple of hours a week. It really depends on what you can give to us. We sort of look at the core sort of buckets that we're sort of tackling in tech facilitated abuse. Mobile phones is probably the biggest one. Everyone's got a mobile phone. Perpetrators use them. Obviously, our clients use them, and they're generally the device that gets hit up the most. Naturally, we looking at various different threats on those phones, from apps, spyware, basic Find My iPhone type features, those type of things, exposing data and the likes. I think the second one that we're going to deal with is not necessarily, I'm not putting these in any priority order, but if you think about the type of abuse we see, is the online abuse. So we're buckling that into OSINT, but really what that means is online, right? So that's social media. Is the social media account secure? Maybe the accounts are secure, but their friends and their colleagues and their co-workers aren't. And through those networks, they're being exposed. Maybe there's fake profiles abusing them, engaging with like the safety commissioner in those cases if we can, and just general leakage of personal data. The next one on the list would be IoT. And vehicles, predominantly vehicles. Vehicles are becoming way more capable now. I think I heard the term earlier today. It's a computer on wheels, right? That's essentially what it is. It has a lot of smarts in it. As soon as you plug your phone in, we know it's using telemetry from that phone. It's contacts and location, and in some cases, insurance information. And that it does extend into other devices. Think of smart home devices, IoT, etc., cameras. The idea of cat feeders, fridges, and washing machines to track when people are at home and not at home. And then finally is that home network scenario. Is that network secure? Has there been anything deployed that shouldn't be in there? Bluetooth devices, Wi-Fi, and the like. And is there some areas we can help tidy that up? So I'm going to hand over to Chris just briefly to talk about the sort of the proactive side of the response.
Yeah, thanks, Brett, and thanks for joining everyone. So I'm going to talk about our education program, and there's two parts to that. So one part is around the volunteer education, which I'll come back to a bit later on. But now I want to talk about the victim survivor and the organisations who support them. The education will deliver to those audiences. So as we've said, there's the device cleanup aspect, but this is more around being proactive and being preventative and putting education out there around how you can protect yourself. So the reason for doing that is to increase understanding of online risks, supporting early intervention, and then strengthening community resilience. So within that education, we've got three aspects. So one of them is scenario-based, skills-based training that we'll make available via e-learning. The next part is the short videos we're going to prepare on really targeted topics. So, for example, how to make your WhatsApp account private, or how to factory reset your phone, how to switch off Bluetooth, those kinds of things. So a whole bunch of very targeted, very short form content that we'll make available for free in a number of public channels that could really help a wide audience. So that's the second part. And then the third part is the facilitator-led training. So this is like a half day or whole day workshop that we'll deliver to the organisations to really upskill those people, and so they can help the victim survivors that they're supporting. So there's quite a bit of work to do. Hopefully there might be one of you out there that's interested to help me with preparing these materials. It's early days, but we have a really good handle on kind of the materials we need to prepare. We've made a start on those. So this is our education program.
Chris, so a little bit about the mechanics behind volunteering and what it looks like and how we're going. I think the key thing to keep in mind is we are building as we are talking at the moment. Hopefully you've got an expression of interest. We'll look at that application, have a discussion with you, go through sort of some screening aspects of that to work out your skill sets and what you can offer. A bit about the safety nets around why we do background checks naturally in the work we do and the type of victims and clients we're going to deal with. Background checks are super important. The reason we do the screening is to protect you as a volunteer, our clients, and of course the organisation. So we want to make sure we're bringing on the right people, some basic background checks, police checks, etc. In some cases, working with children's checks, because naturally we do get involved with cases where there may be children. And just generally using networks and people we know, that's going to help us get people on that we can rely on. At a high level though, how does it actually going to work? And again, work in progress, there's a caveat, but essentially we get cases through our referral programs, which can either be through our website, sometimes we have them through law firms, we have them through caseworkers. What we'll then look for there is how do we triage that? And we're working on those capabilities of what that triage looks like. In essence, different help will have different levels of risk. We often deal with people who just don't know, they're just concerned. They don't trust the devices or their networks or whatever, and they just don't know if it's safe. Obviously, there's a case that comes through that is a little bit more serious and does require law enforcement. We'll deal with that and triage it appropriately. And through that triage and assessment process, that'll determine the type of skill sets we need. What sort of job is it? Are we talking about a mobile phone, a car, some OSINTs? And that's how we'll then match our volunteer database of skills and location and requirements around that. Keeping in mind, some of this work can be done remotely. So we're open to anybody from anywhere. But obviously some of this stuff will have to be done physically at safe locations that we're working through with some of our partners that provide those locations. So obviously during the event, we're going to give you support. You're not going to be working alone. Myself and James and others as they come on board as more senior technical leaders will be there to oversee and supervise and help, make sure everything's going to plan. You might have your preferred tools you like to use and methods, and that's all cool. But essentially, we will have some standardized tools that we'll provide. There's some tools that you may not own or afford, so we'll have those available. And we're going to be standardizing on case management systems and the like, so that way we're all working from a similar process and framework, and also logging and documenting as required. The last part of all that, as we go through the mechanics, is the case gets closed, we remove it and tidy up the data. I'll flip over to you again, Emerald, just to sort of step through the whole safeguarding aspect of the process.
Thank you, Brett. So safeguarding is incredibly important to us on so many levels because of the work that we do in the environment that we do it, and because of the people who rely on us. So at its most fundamental, safeguarding is essentially a philosophy that drives our practice of putting safety, dignity, and well-being of clients first. This is not just reflected in our policies and procedures, not just reflected in the culture that shapes how we work, but it will also be reflected in how the organisation is set up and operates. We're currently recruiting for a clinical manager. So that particular role and who that person is, there's someone with psychological credentials and experience, and someone who's also worked in domestic and family violence environments as either a counsellor, psychologist, or a case manager. And what we will be doing is we'll be relying on this clinical manager to provide guidance on complex cases, to advise us on safeguarding strategies, and to help us risk manage those cases and ensure volunteer wellbeing. So what that might look like in practice, an example of how that might work. Let's say hypothetically we have a case that comes in, and during the triage process, we get to understand that there might be a threat of the perpetrator being able to locate the victim survivor and perpetrate violence. So that would immediately be a risk flag that this case might involve law enforcement, but also the clinical manager to help support, provide advice and assist. Like Brett said before, all of our primary volunteer supervisors have done our safeguarding training, so they understand the concepts and what it looks like in practice. So they'll provide supervision and oversight as you step into the role and get the hang of safeguarding. Safeguarding is also reflected in our secure systems. What we mean there is that we're really careful in how client information and volunteer information comes into our systems, where it's stored, what the data storage retention schedules are, etc. One of the questions we got asked earlier today was, what systems will you be using to hold volunteer information, which I thought was an excellent question. We're currently looking at a software platform called Rosterfy, that's Rosterfy, and they are, as far as I'm aware, ISO certified and have an exceptional reputation for data security. The other thing that we do is establish really clear boundaries and then work as a team. So we really encourage culturally and through our supervisionary practice for people to ask questions, pepper us with questions, ask as many questions as you can think of, because we're all on this learning journey together. Now, Brett alluded to this, and I thought he sort of covered this pretty well already, but I just wanted to reiterate this point again, that something else that is really important to us and that we're providing is flexible volunteering. So what we mean there is that there are no minimum weekly hours. You contribute when you're available. And using that software platform, essentially what it will provide us with is a scheduling system or a calendar system. So you'll be able to access that platform, go in and at the start of a week or a month or whatever our cycle is, designate the times at which you'll be available. Like Brett said, you can volunteer remotely. There are roles that can be performed from home. However, some site visits might be required. And just to give you an example of this, say we intake a case where a victim survivor has requested a bug sweep of a vehicle. Of course, we'll need to go out and do that at a physical location. Now, we're running our trial program currently in the Melbourne area. And so a lot of those on-site visits will initially be focused in Melbourne. We anticipate that this sort of trial period will go for a few months, because what we really want to do is we want to use this as an aggressive learning opportunity. So essentially we want to learn as much as we can from this trial period, test and adjust our systems and processes, fix the things that aren't working so well, so that we can really bed down effective ways of working and optimal delivery. And once we've done that, we'll then look to expand nationally. The other thing that we really encourage you to do is seek opportunities, or choose the opportunities that you want. And you don't necessarily need to make that decision based on relevant skill sets. You might find that you're really interested in learning another domain of cyber, or cross-skilling to make a sideways career transition. The other thing I just want to reiterate as well, and this comes back to that point about safeguarding, we really encourage volunteers to take breaks when needed. So we absolutely work by the ethic that life comes first. So there is absolutely no issues, no judgments in stepping back and then returning when you're ready. Over to you, Chris, just to talk about sort of education opportunities that are available for volunteers.
Yes, thanks, Emerald. So this is about our volunteer education program. So as it says here, you have some skills, but you don't need to know everything. So along the journey, you'll receive training. So we have a great induction training package, and then receive support as you go along. So we've said it already, but I'll say again, you might have skills in one area. So for example, if you're a networking guru, but you're interested to learn more about mobile, then our cohort of volunteers have different skill sets. So you can work alongside someone, and we work as a community if you want to learn more in other domains and other areas. So yeah, it's super important. You're giving to the organisation and you need to get something back. And I think the next slide is, so just a little bit about me. So I'm a volunteer here, and my role is the Learning and Development Manager. My background is as a project manager, actually, but part of that, I've done a lot of change management, a lot of training, and it's a real passion of mine. So when you're implementing a new system, it doesn't really work if people don't understand how to use the system, if they don't know what to do, and they have lots of workarounds. So that's a real passion for mine. In terms of why the Digital Resilience Project, so I have a close friend who experienced domestic violence, and I've seen a lot on the news, it's getting talked about, but there's often a feeling that, it's a too hard problem, there's nothing we can do. But when Emerald approached me and told me about this idea, that it seemed so hopeful and so positive that actually there is something practical we can do. I'm a doer and a practical person. So yeah, I found it super inspiring, and Emerald's been amazing to work with. So I encourage you all to come and join us. So James, I might hand over to you.
Yeah, definitely. My name's James. Also a volunteer here, and it's really hard to go last, I won't lie, because everyone's said it all already. But you can see by the couple of lines I've got there, I've done over 20 years in the IT industry, and the big reason for me wanting to join up, wanting to volunteer my time to help out here is that, much like Chris just said as well, I've been around people that have been affected by domestic violence, and so I've helped them through a lot of things like that. But thinking about all the knowledge I have about how IT systems work and how just exploitations and how things get exploited, it's great to be able to put that to use for a good reason like this, and actually be able to turn it around and tell people that Find My iPhone's been enabled on your phone. So what does that actually entail, and how can we help you protect against that? I want to touch on that word cyber that's in my lead cyber volunteer thing. So Brett mentioned it before as well. It's not a solid word, okay? Like, we're not after cyber people, we're after everyone. We need people that vehicle forensics and training on mobile phones and how they use and things like that. So I think that's why all my experience, my diverse experience, and all Brett's diverse experience, and Chris's, everyone is in IT, but we all come from different areas of that thing. So I think it's coming together, we can really hopefully make a dent in prolonged domestic violence cases. But yeah, so that's it for me for now.
James. All right, we're just going to wrap up in a second, but I thought You can hit our website if you haven't already looked it up. There's a button there to show your expression of interest to become a volunteer, or you can trust this QR code. You can trust it, believe me, and click apply there. We don't do this full time at the moment, so please be patient with us. We have a fair few interests. We're going to go through them. We're going to vet them. We're going to start relatively sort of small. We're going to look at the skill sets we need straight away, and we're going to build from there. But that doesn't mean we're not going to call on you later. So put your interest in. We'll see what you've got. We'll be in contact over the next few days, if not the next week, and just start building and growing from there. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your night.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you
Cheers,
very
everyone.
much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Lovely to see you again, Emerald.
No,